of speeding.
Sound of speeding right down?
Sound speeding.
Okay. Once again, thank you for being here. So, Dana's going to come in and slate for us.
Sex Nation, Audrey Werner, take one.
Thank you. Okay. 1 second.
Sure.
All right. If you could first just start by saying your name and occupation for us.
Oh, sorry. I was like, is my badge on? Because I want to make sure that was off.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. My name is Audrey Werner. I'm a registered nurse. My background is working with in the STD HIV clinic, as well as working in the crisis pregnancy centers.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now that you've introduced yourself a little bit, would you tell us a little bit more about your work with Judith Reisman?
I met Judith back in the year 2001, and it was at a time when I was waking up to comprehensive sex education. My experience, I had worked as a sex educator for 5 years, and then I moved in my job to the sexually transmitted disease HIV clinic, where I saw things getting progressively worse. So I started to question sex education, and as I started to question it, I realized I needed help. And so calling out to the Lord, and He put some pretty amazing people in my path. And when I said I was not an expert in Kinsey, suddenly Judith Reisman came into my life. Through the RSVP campaign that she worked on from 1994 to 2001, she had worked on a campaign of restoring social virtue and purity to America, with the goal of waking up America to the fact that Kinsey's science was fraudulent and criminal, and that it had also been used to change many of the laws in America.
Thank you for establishing that. So what were the Kinsey experiments?
Kinsey was a scientist, but he was a subjective scientist. So he had a goal of sharing the sexually deviant to be normal. When you look closely at his data, and this is not something that we can make up, but you can actually look at his research in sexual behavior in the human male, and in there you will find that he documents how many orgasms does a child have, some in a 24-hour period of time. He interviewed pedophiles who had raped children. For the male data, he went into the prisons and he sought out the most sexually deviant criminals, and he interviewed them and said this is the typical sexual behavior of the American male. Now this is during the 30s and the 40s when American men were over there. They were in the war. And we were a much more modest society. You wouldn't have answered a lot of what Kinsey had asked back then. He also interviewed prostitutes if they lived with a woman, which was against the law in America back then. If they lived with a woman for more than a year, he said this is a typical sexual behavior of the American married female.
Wow. So would you explain also briefly the two works that he's maybe best known for, sexual behavior in the human male and sexual behavior in the human female?
Yeah, he published in 1948, he published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and then in 1953 he released Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Those were his two well-known books. There were scientists and authorities that came out ahead of that with books that actually were talking about, he was the buzz, this new scientist that came in with new revolutionary ideas about human sexuality, looking at it much closer than any other scientist supposedly had done. And so we were set up, the media was already promoting him as a legitimate scientist, and the rest is history.
On that topic, and you'll keep answering to Rebecca,
right.
Audrey, in conversation with Judith, I want to say two names, and just either you say, yes, I want to say something about it, or no.
Mm-hmm.
Alfred Kinsey, Hugh Hefner.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Kinsey had some interesting disciples. One of the people that he worked with was Hugh Hefner, who was the founder of Playboy. Hugh Hefner was in college at the time. He found out about Kinsey's science, thought it was a wonderful idea. As he graduated, he then worked on legalization of pornography. Kinsey had the science to back it up because Kinsey said we're all sexual animals and nothing should be restrained. So Kinsey's science was used to legalize pornography in the 1950s. And we have actually seen the results of that. I, working in the sexually transmitted disease, actually noticed in the 1990s that we had an explosion of date rape. And I later understood the reason for that when I saw a documentary on the pornography industry and saw that during the Clinton administration they had lifted a lot of restrictions off the porn industry, even more so during the 90s. And we were seeing a direct result on public health because of that. Because when a woman's raped, she usually doesn't go to the police. She will go to a sexually transmitted disease clinic to be tested.
I may be overstepping here, and I may be mishearing you, but it almost sounds like you're crediting Kinsey's notoriety to the media. Did he have an educational background in any kind of science?
Kinsey was a scientist, but his expertise was he looked at the sexual behavior of the gall wasp. That was his expertise. He was a professor at Indiana University. And he began equating, he embraced Darwin, so he was equating, you know, we're all animals, what's the difference? And so he went into studying the human, and through that then he also wanted to do more research, so he offered classes at Indiana University, marriage classes, which hadn't been offered before, marriage preparation. But it was really looking at different sexual practices, which again, back then, America was totally different than where they are right now.
Audrey, what impact do you think, and did Judith think, and we're going to, throughout this, I told you, really honor Judith. And
right.
Pick some of her best moments. I think it was the Johnny Carson show.
Right.
Moments where they laughed at Judith, saying,
right.
"You're out of your mind."
Phil Donahue show.
Phil
yeah.
Donahue show.
Yes.
You can make a note of the Phil Donahue show. But what impact do you think Kinsey had on American sexuality as we know it today? The Love is Love movement in the 60s, the AIDS epidemic breaking out. What impact did Kinsey had long term?
Kinsey's science, and I always have to put quotations around it because it wasn't truly science. It was propaganda that was sold to America. But his science has shifted America from its biblical foundations. It has shifted, you know, as I have said before, Kinsey's science is the root of a tree, if you understand that. And from the tree, the root, then we look at the trunk of the tree, and that was our legal system. Kinsey's science was used by the American Law Institute to draft the Model Penal Code in the sex offense section. And from that, we have the changing of American law. Laws that were based, we're a Christian nation, not because we have more Christians or churches, but rather we're a Christian nation because our laws and our government were founded on the principles of the Old and New Testament. So it had been constant throughout the years. So something had to be used to shift us off that standard. So Kinsey's science came along, that became the root of the tree, the American Law Institute being the trunk of the tree. From that, you have the branches of child sex trafficking, sex education, the legalization of abortion, sodomy, all of these things that have happened.
Your opinion, and I'm well documented on this, but your opinion on the impact comprehensive sex ed will have ultimately on sex trafficking and the further fall of America's moral culture.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking to the topic of the effects of comprehensive sex education from a sex educator as well as a sexually transmitted disease nurse. I had the opportunities of being on both sides of this. So I was trained by the SICUS model. I was trained in how to teach comprehensive sex education to children. We were never taught abstinence. We were taught children are sexual from birth, which is Kinsey's model. And from that, I went into the schools, and even though I was told that, I tried to be as modest as I could with the children. Now, that was in the 1980s, and we went into the schools during the HIV crisis that was going on. So suddenly now we're talking about oral and anal sex with children, which is something we never talked about before. Because they were coming across that HIV was a disease that any child could get, and if children are so sexually active or sexual from birth, as Kinsey said, then we needed to get in there and talk to them about that. So I did that for 5 years, and when I moved to the sexually transmitted disease clinic, I noticed that things were getting progressively worse. Children were coming from 1991 to 1999. We noticed the age of first sexual contact was lowering and lowering. We noticed that there was no longer shame and guilt associated with having sex outside of marriage. We saw the rape not only of women by other adults, but we saw the rape of children raping children. So I saw the direct results. I thought, where did sex education come from? Who developed it, and what was the intent behind it? And again, going back and finding Alfred Kinsey being the science that was used, then Hugh Hefner providing the seed money for sex education to go in the schools, and Planned Parenthood actually working with Kinsey and with Hefner, and SICUS, which is the Sex Education Information, I said that wrong. Sorry.
You can start with SICUS,
okay.
Which is...
Okay. And SICUS, which is the Sex Education Information Council of the United States, was actually launched at the Kinsey Institute in 1964. And so we have seen, I have looked at the graphs of national statistics that show that with the sex education being put in the schools in 1964, we can actually see a dramatic rise in teen pregnancy, STDs, and even HIV results. So from that, I've been very concerned about it. And as we are watching this get worse and worse, it's...
that again, from that?
From that, I've been very concerned as well.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. And from that, I've been very concerned about the direction that America is going. We will continue to see, as comprehensive sex education gets to lower and lower grades, we are seeing that children are being groomed for sex. This was never an intent to educate children to prevent pregnancy and STD rates. We've actually seen it explode. We've seen the opposite. This was intended, and this was supported by a man who believed that infants should have sex with adults, and there should be no age limit or restrictions. So comprehensive sex education was really to prepare children to have sex with adults, with each other, and with themselves. So this has been disastrous and will continue to be.
Thank you.
Actually, I was going to say what Judith said because I said to Judith, what I did was I started to try and wake up parents, and I gave them a sex education book that was used for children in 3rd grade, and it describes the act in detail. So I would pick a father, and I would have the father read that part of the book aloud to the rest of the adults in the room, and they never could do it. And I had mentioned that to Judith, and she thought for a moment, and she said, Audrey, once you talk to kids about sex, you're sexualizing them to themselves, to adults, and to each other. And that is why parents are having a difficult time talking to their children graphically about sex, is because God never designed us to do that. We are to protect our children. We are not to sexualize our children.
Fantastic, fantastic. Audrey, if you could, by percentage, in the STD, HIV community, Is abuse prevalent? Sexual abuse prevalent?
I will tell you again from I will answer in terms of, is it prevalent? Is abuse prevalent? Commonly, when we ask a question in the STD clinic, one of the questions that we ask is, what is the first age of sexual contact? And I will tell you, in 1991, typical first sexual contact was 16 or 17 years old. By the time I left in 1999, it was not uncommon to hear 10 years old to be the first age of sexual contact. And I will tell you, we started to have 10-year-old boys coming in who had raped 2- and 4-year-old girls. And we had the dilemma of, how do we interview them? How do we ask these graphic questions when this is a child? This is still a child. So how do we not sexualize them anymore in the interview? And it was becoming more and more prevalent, even in the late 90s.
Audrey, Liberty University embraced Judith.
Yeah.
Can you speak to, and that's, we all engage with Judith and that, and we love Judith, but can you speak to the lack of support in some point of Judith's career, and then support? Just that,
regarding Liberty, or you mean overall?
Overall, and then
Okay.
Liberty, there was some
Because
support,
well, yes,
but
there
also
was.
opposition.
Right.
Because it's a Christian organization.
Yes.
And it's a very tough subject.
Yes. One of the things when I was researching in the 1990s to the origins of sex education, where did it come from, who developed it, and what was the intent, someone challenged me to look at the Christian sex education program. And I looked at the very first Christian sex ed program that was released in 1967. It was called the Learning About Sex series, put out by Concordia Publishing House. And I always say, when you want to look at an authority, when you want to know by whose authority is somebody writing a book, you always look at the bibliography. So I looked into the bibliography, and I found Hugh Hefner. I found Alan Guttmacher from Planned Parenthood, and I found Alfred Kinsey quoted directly. And I thought, wow, Kinsey's in the church. So I started a ministry that actually is called the Matthew 18 group, based on Matthew 18, 15 to 17. If your brother's sinning, you go to them. If they don't listen, you go to take someone else. If that doesn't work, you take it to the church. What do you do when the church is in error? The entire body of Christ. So I made it my mission to start to look at Christian sex ed programs, Christian books that are based on marital intimacy, and look at Christian materials that's being taught in universities, because it's not uncommon for human sexuality to be taught at Christian universities. My husband even experienced going to a Christian university, and I told him ahead of time, I said, you're going to get Kinsey. And he said, no, I'm not. The second day of class, he called and he said, okay, I just got Kinsey. And so the problem is that Kinsey has been brought into the church. And so you have, I do the Matthew 18 process. I've done it with pastors before who have done sermon series on human sexuality. I've looked at their bibliographies. I've found Kinsey. I've found other pro-pedophiles. And so I will sit down with a pastor and try and discuss this with them and talk about the materials that they're using, who Kinsey was, what he did. And at the end, they'll always look at me, and not always, but sometimes they'll look at me and they'll say, so what's your point here? And I'll have Kinsey's book in one hand and I'll have the Bible in the other hand. And I'll say, the reason we're losing this battle right now is because we're talking from this in the church. And God has called us, and I hold up the Bible and say, it's supposed to come from this and this alone. So a little leaven corrupts a whole loaf, it says in Scripture. A little bit of Kinsey meshed with Scripture has been disastrous for the church.
Yeah.
Did anybody say that in the film?
No.
I've been to focus on the family.
Okay.
And I'm not going to err there either. So, yeah.
Bear with us.
Yeah.
So Audrey, obviously the the 60s, and in the 80s and the 90s, being from South Africa, HIV, massive. And then other elements come in.
Right.
Same character, Anthony Fauci.
Right.
AZT.
Yep, all the same.
Can we just touch on that? That's not directly trafficking in Kinsey, but it is
Right.
about sex.
Right.
And it's about lies in
Yes.
sex. It's further lies.
Yes.
So whatever you want to say about that movement, dealing with the HIV community with a drug like AZT, the propaganda behind it, anything you want, because what I'm doing is tying it together for people, saying it's a multi-pronged attack.
Yeah.
It's not just, this dragon has many heads.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And coming from my background working in the STD clinic, HIV clinic, where we did HIV testing on several individuals, we had to go through training. So the CDC provides training for all of us nurses. So we went down to the University of Cincinnati to go through this training. Now, throughout working in the clinic, we were always taught to pass out condoms. We were passing out condoms like they were candy, promoting safe sex. I get to the CDC school and they tell us that HPV is a disease, a sexually transmitted disease, that condoms does not prevent the transmission of. And I thought, why are we talking about safe sex, but we're giving these condoms out and telling people that they're fine, they're going to be fine as long as they use condoms. So that was a huge lie that the CDC was putting out there in our training. I always say that Kinsey science has infiltrated the field of medicine because we no longer are looking at the fact we're not batting an eye if a 13-year-old, I will tell you, a 22-year-old man came into the clinic to get birth control for this 13-year-old. That was his sexual partner. And because of the way the laws were in the state I was in, because I was working in a public health department, a government agency, we were recognizing that 13-year-old as a consenting adult. She looked like she was 10 years old, and I couldn't call her mother, I couldn't call the police. Now, if she'd been 12, I could have. But because she was 13, I could not call anyone. I'm not sure what else to say.
That's great, that's great. Go back to your questions if you don't mind. That's amazing.
Let's return to Judith Reisman.
Okay.
If you could give me an overview of her work and achievements, but also pain points that maybe the public doesn't know.
Judith was a pioneer. She was a gutsy lady. She was a lioness. She was a mama bear. And I think this all started with the fact that she had a child, a daughter who was raped at the age of 10 by a 13-year-old neighbor boy. And she was told repeatedly, well, boys will be boys. This is normal. And she questioned, where did that come from? And that's where she came across Alfred Kinsey and started doing the research on him and has become the #1 authority in the world on Alfred Kinsey. She went in 1980. She went, I believe it was to Israel, to a conference to discuss with all of the sexologists the fraudulent nature behind Kinsey science, because it wasn't science at all. And she ran out of there. So she's not afraid to stand up against, I believe she has been sued by Playboy several times. She's not afraid to stand up against the most evil of people in this world. And she continued to champion children and to fight for this, for the children of the world, but to fight against this demonic evil that is being pushed as science, as being the fuel for the sexualization that we've seen in America just over the last 70 years to what's happening in the world, because Kinsey testified all over the world. So Judith would go across the world. She went to different countries to testify to the legitimacy of Kinsey science. So she has never backed down from the fight. She actually died at her desk doing what she loves best. She has taken many of us under her wings, and I will tell you there are a lot of other Judith Reismans out there that are continuing the fight for her. She has always wanted to shut down the Kinsey Institute. We continue to work on that to this day. And she's been an inspiration for all of us.
Audrey, your work today in 2022, what is the level of challenge now that we're facing according to you with this hyper-sexualized culture, but now we're in a movement here where it's really, there's a big push to normalize sex with children. How does that impact the medical society?
Oh, it has, the sexualization of children has affected every institution. You have the schools that are now pushing it. You have the legalization of it. The most recent, the American Law Institute, the most recent version of the Model Penal Code will make it normal, will make it easier for children to be trafficked. You see it in the field of medicine because we're not going to question if a child has a sexually transmitted disease, but rather we're just going to treat them and put them back out there. So and sad to say, it has affected the church. The church is not fighting this. I have so many people who are so frustrated with the fact their pastor isn't behind them. And they're having to do this alone. They're not doing it with the spiritual support. And I think that's the most heartbreaking thing to me. But again, going back to the fact that the church has been sexualized, so it's been compromised. And so it makes it very difficult to fight this fight. But I always say we have, as Judith has said, we have Almighty God on our side. So we are on the winning side, I will say. It's not hopeless, and my own experience, I have been beat up a lot. My husband used to be a church worker, lost his career in the church, partially because of me trying to wake up people to the fact that Kinsey was in our Christian sex ed. And I prayed in 2018. I said, okay, Lord, just get me to the remnant. I ended up in Austin doing a legislative briefing, which I'm surprised at that. To wake up a few legislators to where did comprehensive sex ed come from and how has it affected children. And I met a pastor at Dallas Theological Seminary who's from Uganda, and I actually went over to Uganda in 2019, and from the timing, again, God's timing, went over to Uganda. It happened to be at the moment when they were about to put comprehensive sex education in their schools. God opened a door for me to speak on my very last day of the trip in Parliament to Parliament members. And I like to say a mama with the help of Almighty God went up against the UN, Planned Parenthood International, and God halted sex ed from going into the schools in Uganda. I just watched the proceedings, and again, just last week, Uganda has reaffirmed that they are not abiding by the UN agreement they had originally signed to put comprehensive sex education in their schools. So Africa is doing something right. And again, America has a lot of uphill battle to do because we've had it here. And other countries are watching. I know Africa is watching us and knows that we are a very immoral country. As a matter of fact, I spoke in a village in Uganda to 120 pastors, and one pastor stood up and he said, I have to tell you that I've hated America and I've hated Americans because you're so hypocritical. You say in God we trust, but here you are pushing abortion and gay marriage and comprehensive sex education on us. But I learned today that there's a woman, you, who's fighting this, and I know other Americans are fighting this. So I'm going to think of America totally different. I thought, such a God moment. Such a God moment.
I do, yeah. Wow, thank you. Okay, your documentary, Mind Polluters. How does your work with Judith Reisman influence that?
It was an honor. I've been working with Judith. There's a small group of us that are working on taking down the Kinsey Institute, defunding the Kinsey Institute. So some are in Indiana, some are here in Texas, and we've been working on that with Judith. It's been exciting to work alongside her on this project. And so now I was happy to be a part of The Mind Polluters, which was a film that exposes comprehensive sex education. And just watching the few states that it's been in, because of course the media doesn't want to show it anywhere, but just watching a few states where it has been shown a lot has affected, it's waking up the people. And I know Judith has been thrilled, or was thrilled, with the project. She's been speaking on this for a long, long time. So this movie has made an impact. I'm excited about this movie that we're making today because I believe my prayer has been for the last 30 years, once I found out all this information, was, Lord, take the blinders away from your people's eyes so that they see what is going on. But I've also prayed, soften their hearts, because they have to be ready to receive the truth. And if we want to be honest, we've all been born into the sexual revolution. We know no different. So this is a time for us to look back to what was America like before the sexual revolution, before Kinsey's science was brought onto the scene, because it was totally different. And so I would love to see us get back to that, and I know Judith would as well.
Great, Audrey. In your engagement in a medical setting, and understand it's a medical setting, with HIV patients, is there, you may or may not be able to answer this, but is there an awakening, aha moment of like, man, my actions or the choices that I made has now produced these results? Have you seen that ever?
Well, I only worked in the clinics from 1991 to 1999. There were times when I would have to tell gay men that they were HIV positive. Sometimes I was telling IV drug users. So this was a population that was involved with risky behaviors. They know they were involved with risky behaviors. So some were even expecting to get a positive result back then when we would do the testing. It's been a while since I've done the testing, but they knew what they were in for.
What is a day in your life like today? Outside of the activism, but the actual clinical work, the work as a nurse. What do you...
Well, right now I am working with seniors, 55 and older. And I will tell you, a lot of them are very concerned about the moral direction of America. And they are perplexed with how we got here. I'm able to shed a little bit on, with my background, but right now we're dealing with the COVID issue. So as a nurse, it's very frustrating because I'm seeing the effects of COVID, but more importantly, I'm seeing the effects of the vaccine on the population. And my hands are tied, and I can't speak to it. I can't warn. I can just encourage people to be educated consumers. I encourage them in the fact that there's two groups of doctors. There's doctors over here that are talking one way with Dr. Fauci and the media, and then you have these other doctors over here who are being attacked and their licenses are being taken away. That's pretty striking. So it's very disheartening right now. It's very disheartening to work with seniors because I'm watching them leave the earth way too early.
Audrey, anything that you'd like to say that's on your heart? And here we don't pull any punches. So anything you'd like to say that you want to sound an alarm on, or even maybe a little bit prophetic of what you think is coming? I don't expect anything, but anything you want to say, free forum, please go at it.
What I tell, I have friends who are discouraged. I have my patients who are discouraged. But what I tell them is, I believe it's going to get worse. As Judith said in the film, The Mind Polluter, she said it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think we're in the time of great awakening. The blinders are coming off of people's eyes. They're starting to see what is happening. The movie The Mind Polluters has woken up the parents of America, and you see these parents groups that are rising up. We are the first and last line of defense for our children, and that's why I don't think it's the government that's going to save America. I don't think it's the churches that are going to save America. I think it's we, the people. I think it's the moms and dads, the grandmas and grandpas, the patriots of America that are going to save this nation, but we can't do it on our own. This is, I think we're in our Red Sea moment, so it's going to be an act of Almighty God, and certainly taking those blinders away and people getting ready to hear the truth, because when you deep dive into this, as I'm sure this film does, you're going to see a lot of ugliness, a lot of evil intent against our children. So I'm thankful that there are movies that are coming out. I am thankful there are speakers that are coming out. I'm thankful there are courageous people who are not afraid to speak the truth. So it's an exciting time to live in America, that's for sure.
I'd like two definitive statements. One, if you could, and this is from your words and in your own words, that Kinsey's work was foundational and directly contributed to and continues to contribute to the trafficking of children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Kinsey looked at children as sexual beings. He felt there was no harm in children, even infants, having sex. And so he does contribute to the child sex trafficking that we see today. His science was used to change the hearts and the minds of our legislators, of our church leaders, of our teachers, to no longer look at children through Jesus' eyes as innocent and precious, but rather to look through children through Kinsey's eyes. And that has been devastating. So it's no surprise that because of the pornography industry and the sexualization of children through that as well, we are seeing more and more deviant. We're moving toward that. And what's more deviant than sexualizing and having sex with a child, raping a child? I can think of nothing more awful. But again, we're being led down that path. And Kinsey's science definitely was a catalyst that was used. I think it was a greater force than anything else to sexualize children and to move us in this awful direction.
I was going to ask about porn, but you worked porn in there.
Yeah.
Pornography in there. That was
Yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, Judith did studies. One thing, she worked in the RSVP campaign. She worked with Colonel Ron Ray, who was the former assistant to the Secretary of Defense under Reagan. And he was looking at the effects of porn also on our American soldier. And one of the things, so there was a lot of porn that Judith had to look through, but she even found that even in the early days of Playboy, you can see it there. There are schoolgirls, the schoolgirl in the uniform. That was a sexualization of children. So this is, and I will add, this is something in regards to working in the sexually transmitted disease clinic. One of our jobs was giving immunization to children. We would work 3 hours doing STD testing, HIV testing, and then we'd do an hour of giving immunizations to children. And we were giving hepatitis B shots. And I've asked parents, how many of you parents know that hepatitis B is a sexually transmitted disease? that is transmitted through anal, oral sex, and through vaginal secretions and semen. So we see this is now we are giving immunizations, and I've heard we're coming out with a monkeypox vaccine. And Judith had once said that's because you need to get rid of the evidence. When an adult has sex with a child and a child gets an STD, then you know something's wrong because this should not have happened. A child obviously has been raped by an adult. So giving STD immunizations to children now is to eliminate the evidence. And that's something I hadn't thought of before. Sorry, I kind of threw that in, but
Please don't apologize.
yeah, I just thought of that
Should be
because
saying
they
you're welcome. Thank you, Audrey.
yeah.
Audrey, yeah, thank you. Please, before you leave, tell Rebecca how you want to be credited
Okay.
in the film. And this is coming out quick. It's 2 years in the making.
Wow.
We're going to be right around 50 plus hours of interviews.
Wow. How long is this movie going to be?
It's going to be lengthy.
The answer is yes.
But it releases,
Part 1 and part 2?
But it releases October 6th, so
Wow.
you don't have to wait so long.
Okay.
You filmed first, and it's truly all-encompassing. It's good. Thank you so much. Well done. I would love a picture with you. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Audrey.
Yes.
Sit right there, right there.
Okay.
We're gonna take a picture on the right.